Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, Thank you very much for joining us today. Hope everybody can hear me clearly here, as well as on the web. Um, Thank you for joining us again today. My name is Nesamani Kalandur, manager of the team conducting the technical analysis for the SB 375 program at CARB. I also would like to introduce Nicole Dolney, Chief of Transportation Planning Branch at CARB, and then Shannon Hatcher is a program staff in the Transportation Analysis section, which is part of the SB 375 program at CARB. Before diving into the presentation, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping notes before we move further. Those who are in the room, please look around now and identify two exits closest to you. In some cases, an exit may be behind you. In the event of fire alarm, we are required to evacuate this room immediately. Please take everything with you and exit down the stairways to a relocation site across the street. The drinking fountain and restrooms are located out the doors at the back of the room. Go to the left, then left past the glass sculpture hanging from the ceiling. The drinking fountain and restrooms are located there on the right side of the place there. For web audience, please send us your questions at sararm@calepa.ca.gov. I'm sure it's flashing on your screen, so you can use it. Let me just go over the overview of this presentation. First, we'll briefly provide background on SB 375 program. Then we will discuss the need for updating SCS program and evaluation guidelines and changes we made since the release of initial draft guidelines. Finally, we will go over the comments we received on the initial draft and the CARB's responses to the comments and next steps as well. As you all know, SB 375 supports the state's climate goal of reducing GHG emissions through coordinated transportation and land use planning. MPOs are required to develop plans that achieve per capita GHG emission reduction as part of the Regional Transportation Plan, or RTP. Regions do this through the development of either a Sustainable Community Strategy, or SCS, or an APS, or Alternative Planning Strategy. The intent of the SCS is to better integrate land use and transportation policies to meet long-term sustainability goals. In March 2018, the board had updated SB 375 GHG emission reduction targets, which became effective on October 1st, 2018. As part of that action, the board directed CARB staff to update its current SCS review process to focus on changes to land use and transportation strategies and investments that MPO regions are making from one SCS to the next, and to increase program transparency by developing additional reporting and tracking guidance within the SCS program and evaluation guidelines. Further, it provides more transparency and consistency in how CARB conducts SCS evaluations. In addition, it'll also clarify expectations regarding level of details and resolution of data submitted to, by MPOs to CARB. This slide shows CARB's engagement process with public and stakeholders throughout 2018 and early 2019. Our workshop began at the beginning of last year with the presentation of initial framework, followed by concepts being presented at the June workshop last year. And then we released the initial draft of SCS program and evaluation guidelines in December last year, and conducted a third public workshop to discuss the main content of the draft guidelines itself. And then we released the second draft guidelines last month after incorporating stakeholders' comments. Today, we are here to share the comments we received and the CARB's responses. Later this month, we will post the final guidelines. This slide shows changes we made since the initial draft of the guidelines we released in December. Comment period was open until Jan 15th, early this year. We received 4 comment letters from various stakeholders, including MPOs and NGOs. The draft guidelines was updated to incorporate applicable stakeholder feedback. Further, the document was revised to improve the organization and flow of our easy readability. You can find the comment letters, response to comments, and the updated guidelines at the web link provided here. This slide shows the strategy-based SCS evaluation process, which consists of 4 key components: tracking implementation, policy commitments, incremental progress, and equity. The policy commitment component is the only component used by CARB staff as the basis for accepting or rejecting the MPO's SB 375 GHG emission reduction target determination. The other 3 reporting components are included to increase overall transparency of the SCS. Tracking implementation will report what progress the region has made towards meeting their GHG target. Policy commitments here, CARB will assess whether the planned strategies and commitments, when fully and effectively implemented, would achieve the stated GHG reductions. Incremental progress will report on what strategies have changed or been added since the last SCS. And then the equity component will report on the efforts MPOs are taking to meet federal and state requirements related to equity. This slide, the updated SCS program and evaluation guidelines will apply only to the MPO's 3rd SCS. The table in this slide shows the date for currently adopted RTP SCSs by MPOs, and then estimated date for adoption of next RTP SCS. So, the SCS program and evaluation guidelines will be updated again as new information and data becomes available. Next, I would like to invite Shannon to walk over, discuss more the comments received and the CARB's responses here.
Thank you. So I'd like to take the remainder of the time to walk folks through our key comments, the key comments that have been received, and to also provide our responses to how we've addressed these comments. This presentation does not cover an exhaustive list of the comments and responses, such as proposed text changes and things like that. But I'm hopeful that we can provide some clarity for several of the more substantive comments that we've been provided by stakeholders. As Monty had mentioned, we've received a total of 4 comment letters from various stakeholders, which include MPOs and NGOs. And these comments cover a wide range of topics, ranging from proposed text changes to recommendations for changes in our approach. What we've done is we've compiled a complete list of comments and our responses in a separate document, which can be found on the SCS evaluation resources page on our website, which I think we have listed right here. And you can also find the updated SCS program and evaluation guidelines, which has been revised in response to the comments that we've received, as well as some of the clarification and editorial comments that Monty had mentioned. And that document is also located at the hyperlink above. And also at the end of the presentation, we'll be happy to address any other comments or questions that folks may have that we may not have covered in this presentation, or if there's any clarification that folks might request. So let's jump into it. So what we've done is we've arranged the presentation to cover the comments in the 4 main components, in the order of the 4 main components as they're presented in the guidelines. And so we'll first talk about comments that have been submitted and received on the policy commitment reporting component. As the guidelines contain this new reporting component, the tracking implementation component, we've received several comments requesting clarification on the requirements of the tracking implementation component and how they differ from the SB 150 requirements. The first thing I'd like to do is maybe talk a little bit about why the tracking implementation component is included in the guidelines. As folks may recall, during last year's target setting process, the CARB board, they actually requested that CARB staff take a report on the progress of SCS strategy implementation and how regions are, the progress that regions are making towards meeting their SB 375 reduction targets. And this was indicated in Resolution 18-12, which was approved on March 22nd, 2018. And more specifically, talking about the difference between 150 and 375, the 150 report, the focus of that report is to report or to evaluate regional progress using a common set of metrics across all MPOs, while the tracking implementation reporting component as part of the SB 375 guidelines will include additional indicators that are really tailored for each MPO, and it's specific to that region's RTP SCS strategies, key actions, and other entities that are required to implement the SCS. I'd also like to stress that, CARB, we understand that there are multiple organizations that are responsible for implementation of the RTP SCS, and the tracking implementation component serves to help to understand the progress that these regions are making towards meeting their targets and how well the strategies are working. The next set of comments I'd like to discuss have to do with the policy commitment component. And what I've done is we've broken up the policy commitment comments into various key topics, such as elasticities and whatnot. So I'll kind of go through each one, but there was an overall framework of questions that asked how requesting specificity on the 5 analyses that comprise the policy commitment component. And folks were really wondering, how are the 5 analyses going to be used in CARB's SCS determination? Will there be equal weighting, or what's the actual process that CARB will go through as they complete these 5 analyses and ultimately make the SCS determination? And what I'd like to point out is the purpose of the policy commitment component is to assess whether the RTP SCS strategies and commitments, whether they support the stated GHG reductions from the SCS. And the policy commitment, if you recall, is comprised of 5 analyses, which are the trend analysis, the elasticity analysis, which I'd like to point out has been piloted for the 3rd round of the SCS evaluations, the policy analysis, the investment analysis, and finally, the plan adjustment analysis. And what CARB staff will do is, as we go through our analyses, we'll take the entire body of evidence that's presented in the data and the results from these 5 analyses to help support our SCS determination. And it should be noted that the failure of a single test or a single analysis or multiple analyses doesn't mean failure for the MPO. Instead, really what it's meant to show is it's to help to indicate to us, to CARB, whether additional information or clarification is needed from the MPO to really resolve any potential issues that we've identified or questions that we've had as we've gone through our 5 analyses. And so essentially what we'll do is we'll prepare the SCS determination and conduct the 5 analyses as part of the policy commitment component. And if the observed body of evidence, such as elasticities or investments or any other of the analyses that we're conducting, starts to identify questions and point to potential issues, we can then go back and coordinate with the MPO to identify, what might be causing us to have some concern about the strategies versus your stated GHG reductions and how we can work through those issues. Let's maybe start talking about some questions that folks had about specific components of the policy commitment determination component. We received several comments about the elasticity analysis. And in general, some of the comments about elasticity were to remove the elasticity analysis from the guidelines. There's insufficient data to really apply elasticities to the local geographic resolution, and instead, perhaps CARB and the MPO should work together to develop alternative or more SB 375 specific elasticities. One thing I'd like to mention is the elasticity analysis was included by CARB basically at the behest of CARB's board. If you recall from the target setting process, the CARB board requested that we really move away from the modeling-centric focus of our SCS determination and take a more strategy-focused approach. And that's where the elasticity analysis comes in. It's a strategy-based approach that evaluates whether the scientific evidence in literature supports through elasticities the strategies in the SCS and whether they would achieve the applicable GHG emission reduction targets. With regards to there not being enough data nor evidence to apply elasticities at a detailed or local geographic level, there are a number of studies and reports that indicate that regional VMT, which is really a key driver of GHG emissions associated with the SCS, has a quantitative relationship with the implementation of land use, transportation, and other development strategies. And these relationships are known as elasticities. And the empirical evidence and studies that form the foundation of the elasticity analysis are really based on decades of research across multiple regions throughout the country, as well as California. And we also like to point out that MPOs actually often use elasticities as part of their travel demand model development. So these aren't really foreign concepts to some of the folks that are out there. And I'd also like to note that the elasticity analysis, it's really not designed, nor is it able to distinguish the effectiveness of the individual RTP SCS strategies. And it's really not sufficiently robust to discern the effects for certain spatial resolutions. And so given these limitations, the elasticity analysis, described in the guidelines, we feel it's still a reasonable approach to evaluate the RTP SCS strategies that kind of balances, trying to maintain some transparency and also, the technical veracity of, the analysis. And then with regards to, creating alternative approaches to the elasticity analysis, we've gone through a public process to update the guidelines. We've had multiple workshops and webinars throughout the state to try to engage and solicit feedback from stakeholders. And during the process, it's been difficult to try to find alternative approaches and methodologies from stakeholders. But as we've indicated in the guidelines, we are open to alternative approaches as new information becomes available. Continuing on with some comments on the policy commitment component, we did receive some comments requesting that MPOs be allowed to use road user pricing to help demonstrate compliance of the SB 375 targets. And so we want to take a few minutes to briefly talk about that. As we had indicated in our SB 375 target update process, unfortunately, MPOs can't include state road user pricing as part of the SB 375 target demonstration, since state programs are already that result in GHG reductions are already factored into the SB 375 targets, and to include that will in the SCS could lead to double counting. But we feel that MPOs, you can make reasonable assumptions about revenues that are appropriated from the state road user pricing that could be reinvested or reallocated into the region's SCS. Like, for example, if you were to apply state road user pricing revenues into the SCS to fund strategies like transit or active transportation, then the MPO can take credit for those GHG reductions from that reallocation of those state road user revenues into the SCS strategy. And in addition, the MPO may demonstrate compliance through regional or local pricing strategies, such as local regional tolls or congestion pricing. Okay, let's move on. We also received some comments on plan adjustments, where we received a comment that indicated that the SCS should evaluate the effectiveness of each individual strategy, project, and program in reducing VMT and GHGs when describing the implementation status of adopted RTP SCS strategies. And CARB's response is we feel that trying to individually quantify the efficacy of each implemented strategy is really difficult to do due to synergistic and interactive effects across multiple strategies and other exogenous variables in reducing VMT and GHGs. But CARB staff, we will report on the implementation status of RTP SCS strategies and compare really how those indicators and plan performance measure plan performance measures in the tracking implementation reporting section of our SCS evaluation staff report. So we will report on some of those as part of our tracking implementation reporting component that's been added to the guidelines. Maybe we can jump onto the incremental progress component. We received several comments about the incremental progress, indicating that it's outside of the SB 375 program, as well as its applicability to certain MPOs. Some of the MPOs felt that it was more appropriate for others rather than themselves. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about that. Similar to some of the other reporting components and updates to the guidelines, the incremental progress reporting component was added to the guidelines as directed by CARB board in Resolution 1812 from March of 2018. And what we've done is we have revised the guidelines to further clarify the applicability to the various MPOs. And essentially what we've done is we've amended the guidelines to indicate that the incremental progress reporting component is applicable to the big 4 MPOs, as well as the 8 San Joaquin Valley MPOs. And this is based on the staff report from the 2018 target setting process from March of last year. Finally, the last set of comments received on the 4 main components relates to equity. We received several comments on equity, similar to the incremental progress, that it's outside the SB 375 program. And really, MPOs are already following state and federal equity laws and requirements as part of their RTP process. So similar to some of my previous responses, the equity component was added to the draft guidelines at the request of the CARB board, in Resolution 1812. And I'd like to point out with respect to the equity reporting that MPOs are already doing, we're not proposing that MPOs do anything additional beyond what they're currently doing. What we're proposing to do is to simply report on the efforts that the MPOs are undertaking to meet the federal and state equity requirements. And we'll report that in the equity reporting component of our SCS evaluation staff report. And the equity reporting component, it doesn't include any additional requirements beyond those that are required by state and federal transportation planning requirements. And if any additional equity reporting is provided by the MPO, we will report that in our staff report. A final comment I'd like to talk about with regards to equity deals with reporting that all significant strategies, projects, and programs should be adequately analyzed in the equity analysis, specifically with regard to whether and how well they are meeting important community needs of underserved communities. And as I had discussed in the previous slide, we're simply asking and reporting on what MPOs are currently doing consistent with the state and federal transportation planning requirements. Anything above and beyond that MPOs provide, we'll be happy to report. And so now what I'd like to do is maybe jump into just sort of a grab bag of various comments that have been received on the guidelines. This is kind of like the potpourri section from Jeopardy. So I'll take MFAC adjustment for 200. We did receive some comments asking to either remove or adjust the MFAC adjustment methodology that we've been using in the guidelines. As I previously mentioned, SB 375 indicates that MPOs may not take credit for state programs and policies that improve vehicle emission standards, changes in fuel composition, and other state measures that reduce GHG emissions when they're trying to demonstrate their GHG reduction targets. And fleet-wide GHG emission rates can vary from one version of MFAC to the next simply due to changes within the model itself. And because of these changes due solely to the MFAC model, this can actually change the performance of an MPO's RTP SCS, even if nothing else changes within it. And so to normalize the effects from updated versions of MFAC to GHG emissions, CARB staff developed this MFAC adjustment methodology for MPOs to use when they develop their SCSs. And so for the third round of the RTP SCSs and beyond, we're proposing that MPOs should continue to use the MFAC adjustment approach that we've previously developed. And so in other words, the exact same methodology and version of MFAC that was used in the second RTP SCS should be used for the third. The MFAC adjustment methodology, still assures that if nothing else changes, the performance of the third RTP SCS will be identical to the second RTP SCS. And this methodology has been used by by the MPOs in their previous RTP SCSs, so it should be very familiar to folks. We also received some comments indicating that the guidelines include some methodological data, submittal formats, and analysis requirements that could be onerous to the MPOs and could stretch finite MPO resources. And so what we've attempted to do when we were drafting the guidelines was to build flexibility into the guidelines that allow CARB to work with MPO staff for how and what information the MPOs provide to us, with respect to alternative attributes and approaches. And we're hoping that the flexibility that we've built in allows our staff to work with MPO staff to identify when these potential issues may arise so that we could come to acceptable solutions. However, as we work through this with MPOs, we would really like to understand from the MPOs, why alternative data formats or data or other information needs to be provided by the MPO to CARB staff. And we also recognize, there's a potential for MPO capabilities and staff resources to, preclude your ability to provide us sufficient data or analyses. And so what we've tried to do is make things easier for the MPOs. For example, in the data submittal table, we've tried to streamline that, and we've removed 25 variables from the table from what was used for previous SCSs. And so, if folks are having issues with the data table submittal process, we'll work with staff to find alternatives for, the data submittal and data needs. In addition, for example, with the off-model strategies, we've identified various approaches that MPOs can take, but MPOs do have the discretion to come up with their own strategies and approaches as long as they're able to document how their methodology, assumptions, and data sets are consistent with the overall framework that we have identified in the off-model category appendix of the guidelines. So we've tried to really build in some flexibility to the guidelines so that we can work with MPOs to identify where and how we can make things easier for folks. And then finally, we've received some comments requesting that a glossary of key terms be added to the document. So what we've done is we've revised the document to include key terms before the executive summary, as well as additional key terms in Appendix C. So hopefully that should help address some of the concerns folks had about some of the jargon that we use in our document. Maybe we could talk a little bit about our anticipated next steps. We're hoping to release the final guidelines later this month, so be on the lookout towards the end of April. And that really concludes our formal presentation of the comments that we have received and how we've updated the guidelines to address those comments. We'd be happy to answer any questions, and for folks who are viewing the presentation online, you can submit your comments to, I think there's an email address that's flashing on your screen, and then you can also reach out to us at a later date with the sustainable communities at arb.ca.gov if you'd like to reach out to us as well.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, we'll be open for questions here in the room. Please introduce yourself and the agency, and then we would like to go. Okay.
I just want to, Leonard Seitz, and I don't really represent Caltrans, but I was noticing the equity analysis that you were talking about. And as I understand it, you're doing either regional or county estimates of emissions, whereas the equity would need a finer level so you know about exposure to, I guess it wouldn't be for the greenhouse gases, but for other species. That would seem a fairly big increase in the amount of work that the MPOs need to do.
So these relate to equity requirements as laid out in the Regional Transportation Plan guidelines, and then those laid out for federal statute. And Nesmani can probably better reference which statutes those are, but that's separate from, I think, the emissions analysis that you're referring to. Can you highlight which sections?
I think it's given in the Title 6. I think it's well, Title 6 as part of that, it's well documented there. And it's also given in the RTP guidelines, extensively talked about it, and the guidance for the MPOs, what type of conditions they need to do and what type of analysis they have to do. That's what the MPOs are currently following. As part of the SCS evaluation guidelines on the staff report, we'll be reporting what method they use, the quantitative and qualitative analysis, as well as the performance indicators MPOs use. That's what we'll be reporting it here for this program purpose. Yeah. Not as part of this SCS evaluation guidelines, yes.
We have a comment from online. This is from Sarah Dominguez from SCAG. She says, what does it mean that the elasticity analysis is now piloted?
Sure, I can take that question. So, Sarah, thanks for the question. This is really what we mean here is like we'll be going through the process as we described in the guidelines document itself. We'll conduct the analysis, but as you know, through this process, we'll be going through and learning a lot of things like how we are applying the elasticities itself. But for this, for the determination purpose, still we'll go through it and document if we run into any challenges or any issues in finding the data. That's what we'll be documenting in the staff report. So that's why we call it as a piloted. Because we are gathering all the information, this is the first time we are using this approach. in determination policy component of the analysis itself. So that's why we call it as piloted.
I have not gotten any others from online.
Adam Nolting from MTC, and so I'm just curious, going back to the road user pricing perspective, because I think as we've all look ahead at our next SCS and preparing our TPs, we with targets that are going to be a little more challenging to meet. We all know that pricing is certainly an alternative to get to that point. And I know it sounds like from your discussion and the guidelines that we aren't going to be able to take credit for regional type pricing strategies. Is that accurate, or is that more of like a statewide VMT fee we can't take credit for? But if our boards are willing to make some sort of statement that says they're willing to explore this or go forward with something that we can then include.
Yeah, I mean, regional pricing and the direct effects, those elasticity effects you can account for in the RTP SCS. We were referring to state road user pricing. And again, we're even further distinguishing that in that the elasticity element, the sort of direct behavioral response, is accounted for on sort of the state accounting books, but any reinvestment of revenue can be used to meet your targets.
Okay, I mean, that's good to hear. And I think part of the things I'm looking at too is just how that affects auto operating costs. Because I know there's also a new calculator that looks at, that's a draft calculator anyway, that's online, that allows us to plug in for each region and come up with auto operating cost for the various years, 2005 through whatever, 2050 as an example. And so those operating costs get less over time as our vehicles become cleaner and more efficient. So I'm just curious how, if there's a statewide perspective on increasing operating costs for vehicles, is there a way to account for that? Because that certainly has an effect on VMT it's kind of both ways, right? We're accounting for the technology of cleaner vehicles, and we're having to account for that in our analyses because the cost to drive is being less. But in reality, if there's a state program that would look at increasing the cost for driving,
well, and that's
can't take credit for
correct.
it. So it's kind of an odd
increasing
thing
that increasing auto operating costs and the impact that has on driving is what the state has accounted for already. And so when we went through the target setting process, we thought about that a little bit, and we were like, okay, what are the things that we should assign to the states as its responsibility in terms of reducing greenhouse gases? And then what should be part of SB 375? And so that's where we in that process, we said, okay, state road user pricing, let's put that in the state books. And then SB 375, the targets were assigned based on the assumption that you couldn't take credit for that. Had we gone the opposite route, the targets would have looked different.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, Bruce Griesenbeck from Sacramento Area Council of Governments. So one, just I guess a clarification on the presentation on the comments and responses. The statement was made that state road user pricing was already accounted for in SB 375. I don't think that's a true statement. It's accounted for in the scoping plan. I just wanted a clarification on that.
It was accounted for when we did target setting, and like you said, it's in the scoping plan. So it gets at that question of when we did target setting, we could have taken sort of an approach, yes, you can account for state road user pricing, but the targets would have been different. And instead we took the approach of, okay, we're going to carve that out, that's part of the state, and so your targets, the MPO targets, look different.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure that I had the placement of that correctly. And then, we're in the middle of the end of our development of our SCS and our long-range plan update, and for us, it's one and the same kind of thing. And we've had a really good, positive discussion with our board on a whole range of topics that are normal fodder for the SCS in terms of land use measures and alternative modes and compact development and jobs, housing balance, and all that stuff. As part of our MTP and our long-range plan update, we have had a conversation with our board about state fuel tax and and the advantages of the need to find an alternative way of collecting revenue for purposes of maintenance and all kinds of other things. So there will be some, our plan will include a lot of that for sure. The other thing, in terms of our SCS tolling, and we're really glad to see in the final guidance that that ARB came down on that local measures are countable and statewide measures are part of the state. It's not that they're not countable, it's just that the state has already claimed credit for those. And leaving the local measures to be part of an SCS, including some of the repurposing of revenues from that. And that's really helpful in terms of doing that. We're definitely looking at different forms of facility pricing, congestion pricing, time of day kind of pricing, and all sorts of variants on that as part of what we're including in the policy side of our SCS. Looking forward to bringing that to you, and I think we'll be now the first MPO bringing our SCS forward under the new targets. There's a little bit of a feeling like we're the first penguin going down into an ice hole, so we're hoping that there's no orca down there for us. But yes, just really appreciated the fact that in the final guidance, the difference between the state-initiated and controlled measures and the local ones was present and accounted for. Definitely looking for, there's a ton of other details. The SCS guidance is a lot more complicated, and I appreciate the fact that there's less elements on the data table, but I do hope that there's an understanding that the SCS guidance is more rigorous than it has been in the past, and it does require a lot of the MPOs in terms of reporting, and we're looking forward to all that, but it is extra work, and we know that you're going to be doing extra work too. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Julia Jordan. I'm with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. And I am just wondering, we work with communities in the San Joaquin Valley and Eastern Coachella Valley, many of whom are low-income communities and communities of color. And I'm kind of thinking about this equity component and wondering, especially, you mentioned that there aren't really additional requirements being made here. And I'm wondering what you see changing in terms of the next round when it comes to really making sure that community input is included in the projects in terms of which projects get selected and what sort of prioritization there is. For us, we're seeing that not all, but a lot of the MPOs we work with are not really fully integrating community input and priorities into their plans. And many are adopting whatever cities and counties suggest, which often are not really having these robust engagement processes. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing here is an effort to elevate the conversation. I mean, we first need to understand what's going on. But there are a number of CARB programs that are elevating that conversation. We have the SB 350 Community Needs Assessment, where we're promoting the need for regions and localities to assess what are the community's transportation needs and incorporate that into the planning efforts. As part of our SB 150 report, we developed a list of best practices, and some of those include things like participatory budgeting. And then in the AB 16 side of things, when it comes to community emission reduction plans, that I think is another place where we're elevating the community role in identifying strategies that work for them and meet sort of the need to reduce emissions as well as mobility goals. So it's a step forward. It doesn't add new requirements, as you said. That is part of other statutory efforts related to the state side and the federal and the RTP development guidelines. But we want to elevate that conversation, bring it to our board, and go from there.
Hi, Tanisha Taylor with CalCog, and just one process question. So we've seen the comments, we've seen the responses to comments. If I have a question maybe tomorrow or Thursday or Friday. Oh God, today's Wednesday, so Thursday or Friday or even Monday. There is an opportunity to reach out to you guys and provide those questions or comments and ask for clarification on maybe some of the things that are in here, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
Tanisha. Yeah, you can
Thank you.
reach out to us always, sustainablecommunities@ERB and it's at ca.gov. Yeah, thank you.
We have another question from our email. This is from Aidan Smith from Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. And he asks, what is the off-model piece you mentioned? Can you explain that again?
Sure.
What is off-model?
Yeah. I think off-model strategies, even currently the MPOs use that. What it means really is like the strategies that the MPOs consider as part of their RTP and SCS, they won't be able to calculate every strategy through use their travel demand models or land use models. So then they need to go and use other methodologies or other tools that's available. So that's what we call it as an off-model strategy, off-model tools. For example, especially the technology like charging infrastructure that comes to my mind immediately is like the travel demand model may not be able to capture the GHG reduction or VMT changes for that strategy. So then they use the off-model strategies. So if you look at the guidelines, the Appendix E, if I'm right, it goes through various strategies that's currently MPOs use off-model. So that's what we kind of documented all the various methodologies. But again, as we said earlier, those are just recommended approaches. MPOs are always, they can always use the other methods, and as long as they can document the assumptions and the data sources and everything. So that's what it is, really off-model strategy there.
Leonard Seitz again. I just want to follow up on the MFAC and electric vehicles. Are you adjusting MFAC to reflect some proportion of electric vehicles?
So the MFAC is going through their own process. As you may know, Leonard, like MFAC 2017 was released, and it's going through the review process. We are still waiting for the US EPA's approval for that. But from this program, the SB 375 program, as you may know, the law says the MPOs can't take credit for the state programs like Advanced Clean Car and Low Carbon Fuel Standards. So that's where we came up with a new methodology, like we call it an MFAC adjustment methodology, where we try to control the impact of any of these changes. So that's what all MPOs used in their second SCS, applying that. What it does is like basically neutralizes the impact of any changes in terms of the MFAC itself. That's what the methodology, the methodology is taking care of that. So for the SB 375 program, if they use that methodology, the performance of the plan, if nothing else changes, will be same across from the plan 2 to the plan 3. So that's the intention of the MFAC adjustment methodology there.
For other purposes, it would be included in the generalized rate?
Sorry, can you repeat
For
that?
other purposes, other than this purpose it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
For other purposes like conformity and other things, they'll be able to use a regular model. Yep.
Okay. And one other question. You've kind of alternated between talking about greenhouse gas reductions and vehicle mile reductions. And not all vehicle miles are the same, particularly at the low speed and high speed. They're quite different. So could you talk about that distinction, and particularly OPR's tendency to talk about vehicle miles and assume that emissions are equivalent?
Sure. I think, as you know, the MFAC model takes care of the speed distribution things. So even in the current process, what happens is the MPOs use the travel demand model to estimate the VMT and the corresponding speed bends. So that's what they input into the MFAC model. So whatever the changes in the speed distributions, that's already accounted for. Those changes are already accounted when they get into the MFAC model. So it's not like 1:1. That's not any assumptions. Maybe it's very close to 1:1, but depending upon what speed band and how much VMT they're doing it, that's how the GHG itself estimated for this program.
Right, but OPR is not paying attention to that. They're just looking at VMT, not at emissions.
I'll just add to that. I mean, OPR and CARB are affirming, and through the scoping plan, the need to reduce VMT. And I assume you're referring to SB 743 in terms of OPRs. policies, and that's a really important policy that changed how transportation analysis was done related from level of service to VMT, and it was a really important change to help promote climate goals and to support infill development.
But it wouldn't be looking at strategies that affect different sets of speeds. For example, the high per mile emission rates at low speed would be treated the same as moderate speed emissions.
Well, I'm not an expert, and maybe Shannon can help me on this. The transportation analysis will still include a look at speeds, but there was an element of CEQA that focused on the analysis of VMT. So
I'm thinking of.
Yeah, so SB 743, that really changed how jurisdictions are analyzing traffic impacts. And previously they used a level of service, which tended to penalize projects that were infill type developments. And so that's what 743 is trying to get around, is a new paradigm for evaluating transportation impacts using a different set of metrics, and VMT is that metric that's being used.
Do you have any other online question, Caitlin?
No other online questions at this point.
Go ahead, Hannah.
Sorry, one more clarification going back to the policy commitments and the reporting. As you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of people that are involved, or different agencies involved in implementation. So in some of the implementation, are we talking about on the ground housing units getting built in infill zones and things like that? Or are we talking about actions the MPOs can take themselves, as an MTC, as an example, supports our PDA growth framework, which is kind of our infill zone areas with planning grants. So that's an action that we take as an agency to help promote more planning at a local level that would promote more infill development to occur. But we don't really have any influence on whether that housing or development gets built. So I guess I'm just curious on how, is that part of both of the reporting? Are we going to report on both of them? One is kind of the policy actions that we're taking, and then one's more like reporting on like what's actually happening.
yes, and I think that's a really important distinction, because we want to recognize the efforts the MPOs are taking, and it may not always result in action on the ground. And so it is differentiating those two things. But and it's also asking the important question of, okay, what are you guys learning through the process? I mean, is this just a matter of time? Are there other barriers that need to be overcome? Or does this suggest maybe you make an adjustment to the plan?
And I think that makes sense, and thanks for clarifying. I think one of the questions we always run into is, right, if we begin a planning exercise to provide more local planning, the plan may be developed, but to get implementation, that could take years and years for actually see anything. So it's hard to really do a lot of course correction to really know exactly if the policies we have in place are getting to our targets or not at this point, because so much the lag period for development or even transportation projects. So just, I guess that's one of the caution areas that we look at.
Yeah, and we recognize all those. I think we unlike the prior evaluations, we didn't focus on or ask those questions, and it's not a predetermined answer. It's just how do we elevate those conversations? And also just through the SB 150 report, there were a lot of real barriers that I think more people became aware of, and we want to do more of that as we go through the next evaluations.
Great, thank you.
I don't see any more online questions.
Other question, last chance, just at least in the room. Thank you again for everyone for coming. Maybe we'll be happy to take any other questions you may have through the sustainable communities at erb.ca.gov. You can always reach out to us. As we said, like later this month, we'll be finalizing it and post the final guidelines itself. Thank you again for joining us for today, this afternoon. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.